Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Presta Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschachade Shatarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare Hare Vanchakapatarubhyas cha kripa sindhubhya eva cha Patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Devotees, we're continuing with chapter 3. And this evening we are hoping to complete chapter 3. We have the final subsection of the fourth section about karma yoga, acting out of duty to set an example. So that we have to do, that's from verse, I think, 31. Let's just check. No, 33. Yeah. So we're going to start with verse 33 and go to the end of the chapter. Just to remind us a little from last night, this section, the section where we are, the overall section, is about karma yoga or devotional service. Yeah. The point is raised a few times that ultimately we're talking about devotional service. Very similar and often the same principles apply. So the idea was that you, Arjuna, you think you're transcendental, you don't need to do your Kshatriya Dharma. But even if you really are transcendental, actually, still you should do your Kshatriya Dharma in order to set a good example for common people who don't really know about, like transcendental subjects particularly. But when you do your Kshatriya Dharma, you do it in Krishna consciousness, with detachment, being attached to Lord Krishna, to the Lord himself. You do it like that. So you're not just setting an example of being a Kshatriya. You're setting an example which is connected with Krishna consciousness. And in this way, if the people are encouraged nicely by good example and good teaching as well, then they can come to the transcendental level. Even though they're starting from ignorance, they can come to the transcendental level, and ultimately they can go back to Godhead. So that is what we discussed last night. And this evening, we are going to go on from verse 33 to verse 35. That's the last subsection, little small division within that overall fourth part about setting an example. So this is now titled, One Should Perform One's Duty in Krishna Consciousness according to one's nature, without attachment or aversion. Okay. So let us just read. There's only 3 verses. Let us just read those 3 verses, and then we'll go back and look at them in a little detail. So verse 33, even a man of knowledge acts according to his own nature, for everyone follows the nature he has acquired from the 3 modes. What can repression accomplish? Yeah, this is similar. Oh, anyway, we're just reading the verses. I'll comment shortly. Okay, so what can repression accomplish? There are principles to regulate attachment and aversion pertaining to the senses and their objects. One should not come under the control of such attachment and aversion because they're stumbling blocks on the path of self-realization. That's an interesting point. Yeah, important point. Watch out for attachment and aversion. And 35, it's far better to discharge one's prescribed duties, even though faultily, than another's duties perfectly. Distraction in the course of performing one's own duty is better than engaging in another's duties, for to follow another's path is dangerous. Okay, those are the three verses we're looking at first of all, 33 to 35. Let's just have a little closer look now. 33, even a man of knowledge acts according to his own nature, for everyone follows the nature he's acquired from the three modes. What can repression accomplish? So, of course, what Arjuna is suggesting is a program of repression. Just repress my Kshatriya nature and act like some sort of renunciate, which it's just not Arjuna. It's just not Arjuna. So this reminds us of verse 5. If you remember verse 5, it was very, very similar idea. Let me just read verse 5. Everyone is forced to act helplessly according to the qualities he's acquired from the modes of material nature. Therefore, no one can refrain from doing something, not even for a moment. You got to do something. If you don't do something, well, something is going to do you. So, yeah, something will push you to do it. Okay, so it's similar to verse 5, which we just read a moment ago. And in the purport here, Srila Prabhupada makes the point that to get free from these things, to get free from the modes, you have to be Krishna conscious. There's no other way. You can't really force yourself to do something you don't want to do, or not to do something which is just really you. Yeah. But if you're Krishna conscious, then you can transcend these things. Not just like on the spot, but gradually. Gradually you can do your duty in a renounced spirit for the pleasure of Krishna, and gradually you will progress and become free from the modes, become transcendental. Yes, so, and Prabhupada makes the point that there are many people who are trying to be yogis, trying to be some sort of spiritual person, but because they're not ready, even though they try, after a while they fail. So Prabhupada goes on to explain, this is all in the purport there, it would have been better if they stayed in their position rather than sort of like before they're ready, prematurely try to renounce things. Yes. So there are many of these yogis who are under the influence of their own particular material nature, and they just can't deal with them. So better they just continue on in varnashram type situation until they're more purified. And Prabhupada, in, I think it's the last little sentence or so of the purport, Srila Prabhupada says, no one should suddenly give up his prescribed duties and become a so-called yogi or transcendentalist artificially. It is better to be situated in one's own position and to try to attain Krishna consciousness under superior training. Thus one may be freed from the clutches of Krishna's Maya. Well, this is the point that we're making here. Don't take big chances. Carry on doing your duties in a renounced spirit as much as possible, offering the results to Krishna as much as possible. Gradually purification will happen, and you'll be able to give up those sort of karma kandya Vedic varnashram duties and come to a higher level. So 34, there are principles to regulate attachment and aversion pertaining to the senses and their objects. One should not come under the control of such attachment and aversion because they're stumbling blocks on the path of self-realization. Yes, so the point in principle is that one has to do one's duty. It's being advised that you do your duty, but in a spirit of detachment. And that detachment is from becoming detached from, you could say, enjoyable things on the material level. And you have to become free from aversion, detached from aversion, just trying to reject things, and you may end up thinking of them more because you're thinking how to reject, like that. So there are principles for these people who are doing karma yoga, following the example of a more elevated devotee, performing their prescribed duties. For them to progress, they have to understand that we have to regulate attachment and aversion. If we just let our attachments and aversions just run wild, then we won't make progress. So Prabhupada gives some examples in the purport. We have to avoid unrestricted sense enjoyment. Prabhupada gives the example of householder life in Krishna consciousness. So in householder life, in Krishna consciousness, then a person, a devotee, is allowed to engage in sex life, to produce children, but not unrestricted sex life. So as Krishna says, there are principles, there are rules to regulate these things, and one should stick by those rules. And be careful. And in the purport, Srila Prabhupada makes a kind of, well, it's a nice, expresses things in a nice way. Even though you're doing karma yoga or even devotional service, bhakti yoga, you must follow these principles for regulating attachment and aversion, because even though you're engaged nicely in these ways, if you're not careful, as we read in the second chapter, just one of the senses if it's not properly engaged, can lead a person astray. Just one of the senses. And so Prabhupada says, there is danger even on the royal road. Back in the old days, I don't know, 100 or 200 years ago and more, at least in England, I'm aware, there were two sets of roads. One set was for the common people like you and me. The other set, which was much nicer, was for the royalty. But still sometimes accidents happened on the royal roads. Not as much as on the common road. Yeah. All right, and so now 35, and this is a slightly different point, but it's very relevant for Arjuna, and in general, it's a very important point. It's far better to discharge one's prescribed duties, even though faultily, than another's duties perfectly. Distraction in the course of performing one's own duty is better than engaging in another's duties, for to follow another's path is dangerous. So the thing is, well, in the purport, Prabhupada talks about those who are Brahmins should do Brahmin duties, those who are Kshatriyas should do Kshatriya duties, and not get mixed up, generally. Arjuna, of course, is suggesting that even though he's a Kshatriya, he should stop doing Kshatriya duty and engage in something along the lines, at least, of Brahminical duty. You know, it's hardly even like real Brahminical duty, what Arjuna is suggesting. Anyway, it's something related. So Krishna's saying to him, because Arjuna is facing this very position, he's thinking of doing someone else's duty. And he thinks he can do that better than he can do his own duty of being a Kshatriya and fighting. But the problem is, and it's a very serious problem, is that, and it applies in the case of Arjuna specifically, but it may apply to us also, is that temporarily, due to some circumstances, a person may feel, I don't want to do my duty. This is exactly Arjuna's situation. Oh, let me do some other duty. Due to some circumstances, some emotions being stimulated by some situation, a person may feel attracted to doing someone else's duty, but it's just because of the force of circumstances. And when things normalize themselves again, then the person will find that they can't continue doing the other person's duty because it's not really who they are. And they will just lapse back into their regular duty. This is what Krishna is telling Arjuna, that right now, because of the circumstances, you may feel that you don't want to be a Kshatriya, you want to be a Brahmin, maybe. But after a while, when things settle down, your Kshatriya nature will just push you. You'll have to go back to Kshatriya activity. And if now you've got yourself involved in this other activity of another varna, then you may become very confused. And therefore Krishna says, to follow another's path is dangerous, because you'll find, no, I can't do it. So a person will at least end up very confused about what to do and what not to do. So therefore Arjuna should just continue doing his Kshatriya duties, even though temporarily he feels uncomfortable like that. But then Prabhupada does make the point that if someone is fully Krishna conscious, they may be able to change their position in Varnashram. There are examples. Vishvamitra changed his position. What was he? He was a Kshatriya. Vishvamitra was Kshatriya. He became Brahmin because he was very advanced spiritually. But if you're just a normal person or even a normal devotee, you can't do that. The relevancy of this for devotees is that we're given duties to perform by the spiritual master, by the yatra authorities, and those duties that we're given to do, it's not just whimsical, like, oh, maybe just do this, or maybe just do that. No, Srila Prabhupada makes the point elsewhere that when you are given a duty by bona fide Krishna conscious authority, then you should understand Krishna wants you to do that. Krishna is behind more things than we might realize in Krishna consciousness. So yes, so then if we whimsically decide to give up that duty, Shri Shri Radha Radhana Shri Giri Govardhan Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu Ki, if we whimsically decide to give up that duty, which has been given ultimately by Krishna, oh, that's bad. That's like a sort of a type of rejection of Krishna. Yes, okay, so on we go. And now we go to the last section from verse 36 to 40. Is it 2 or 3? 43. 36 to 43. Let's try and finish this evening. And the basic idea is that while you are engaged in these activities of karma yoga or devotional service, in that renounced spirit and offering everything to the Lord, then you should beware of lust and anger, because, well, as Prabhupada said, accidents can happen even on the royal road. If you're not careful, you can get into trouble. So it's kind of a change of subject, or at least a different element in the whole picture. So let's read through the verses to start off with. 36, Arjuna said, O descendant of Vrishni, by what is one impelled to sinful acts even unwillingly, as if engaged by force? 37, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, it is lust only, Arjuna, which is born of contact with the material mode of passion and later transformed into wrath, and which is the all-devouring sinful enemy of this world. Maybe that reminds you of our verses in the 2nd chapter, which were dealing with lust and anger. Yeah, anyway, let's carry on. 38, as fire is covered by smoke, as a mirror is covered by dust, or as the embryo is covered by the womb, the living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of this lust. 39, thus the wise living entity's pure consciousness becomes covered by his eternal enemy in the form of lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. 40, The senses, the mind, and the intelligence are the sitting places of this lust. Through them, lust covers the real knowledge of the living entity and bewilders him. 41. Therefore, O Arjuna, best of the Bharatas, in the very beginning curb this great symbol of sin, lust, by regulating the senses, and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. 42. The working senses are superior to dull matter. Mind is higher than the senses. Intelligence is still higher than the mind. And he, the soul, is even higher than the intelligence. And the last verse in this whole chapter, 43. Thus knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind, and intelligence, O mighty-armed Arjuna, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, Krishna consciousness, and thus by spiritual strength, conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. Yeah, because while you're trying to do your karma yoga or your devotional service, your spiritual activity for your spiritual elevation, well, yeah, one's old nature, one's previous nature from before, undoubtedly will try to fight back. You think Maya's going to just give up like that? That Maya sees that there you are with a bead bag in your hand, and Maya says, oh, you've become a devotee, I give up. She won't give up without a good fight. All right, so 36. Arjuna said, O descendant of Vrishni, by what is one impelled to sinful acts even unwillingly, as if engaged by force? Anyway, that's the question. Yeah, we will give the answer when we read the next verse. That's the question. But the point is that our conditioned natures are so strong, our habits are so deeply ingrained, after not just a certain number of years of living in material life in this lifetime before becoming devotees, but from many lifetimes. So, and therefore we find that even though we're aware that, no, I shouldn't do this, this will not help me in my Krishna consciousness, but still we feel some sort of impulse, some pressure coming from inside us that, well, you know, maybe I can do it. These things happen, and I don't think that any of us have not had this experience. So then 37, what is it? That's the question from 36. What is this thing that forces us, even sometimes against our will? The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, it is lust only, Arjuna, which is born of contact with the material mode of passion and later transformed into wrath, and which is the all-devouring sinful enemy of this world. Anyway, you remember, I'm sure, from the second chapter, those famous 2 verses, while contemplating the objects of the senses, attachment arises. From attachment, lust develops. And then you try to enjoy whatever it is that you've become attached to. It may be a member of the opposite sex or whatever, some material thing. So then you lustily try and enjoy it, but then you find that the result of that is not satisfaction and peace, but is you become angry, you become disturbed. And then it becomes worse and gradually you fall down. So it's lust, which is born from us having contact with the mode of passion, and then it becomes transformed into anger. Okay, so what happens then, Prabhupada explains in the purport, is that we have a natural love for Krishna within us already, but it becomes, due to contact with Maya, it becomes transformed into lust. And you may think it's still love, but it's not, it's lust. Love means the desire to please the beloved, and lust means the desire to please me. And Prabhupada says, just like milk may be soured and made into yogurt, some sort of souring agent is put in, and then the milk, which is naturally sweet, it becomes sour. Yes, so like this all happens through misuse of our minute independence. Yeah. And the idea is, in the material world, that if we try to enjoy things through lust and we become frustrated, then if we've got at least a little intelligence, then we'll understand that no, this whole program is not right. Prabhupada does mention that it's possible, for example, to use anger in devotional service, like Hanuman. He punished Ravana. He used anger, but he was not being used by the anger, or even lust, like householders having children. They're using lust, but dovetailing it into Krishna consciousness to have a nice Krishna conscious family, and becoming purified in the course of doing that, as long as they do it nicely, of course. Well, Srila Prabhupada explains something interesting here. Listen to this. Elsewhere, he says, Narottam Das praise in Prema Bhakti Chandrika, I will engage lust, anger, greed, illusion, madness, envy, and pride in proper ways in Krishna consciousness. And by defeating these enemies, I'll feel happiness in my heart as I peacefully worship Govinda. I will engage lust by offering it in Krishna's service, means in Krishna conscious household life. I will direct anger towards those who are envious of the devotees, like we mentioned Hanuman, or Arjuna for that matter, at least when he eventually does fight. I'll be greedy to hear the topics of Hari in the association of devotees. I'll feel illusioned without achieving my worshipable Lord. I'll be maddened while singing the glories of Krishna. In this way, I'll engage these enemies in their proper places. 38. As fire is covered by smoke, as a mirror is covered by dust, or as the embryo is covered by the womb, the living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of this lust. So 3 degrees. Fire covered by smoke, mirror covered by dust, embryo is covered by the womb. So, Prabhupada explains, of these 3 positions, or situations, or whatever, the best is fire covered by smoke, because you can perceive the fire under the smoke. Next, not as good, but it's next down, is a mirror covered by dust. But the worst is the embryo covered by the womb. You can't see the embryo because it really is covered by the womb. But anyway, the idea is that if we become Krishna conscious, particularly in the example of fire covered by smoke, if the lust is not so bad, if the lust is just like smoke, then the fire of Krishna consciousness, if the fire is handled nicely, then the fire will break through the smoke. So yeah, therefore that's the best position. And 39, thus the wise living entity's pure consciousness becomes covered by his eternal enemy in the form of lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. I'll just mention from the previous verse 38. Prabhupada comments in the purport, in the human form of life, one can conquer the enemy lust by cultivation of Krishna consciousness under able guidance. So, Prabhupada, now 39, lust is never satisfied, it burns like fire. Prabhupada says, it's said in the Manusmriti that lust cannot be satisfied by any amount of sense enjoyment. Just as fire is never extinguished by a constant supply of fuel. Srila Prabhupada classically gave the example of pouring petrol on a fire. If you throw a whole lot of petrol on a fire, then due to the initial impact, the fire may go down momentarily. But then as soon as it gets hold of the petrol, then bang, it's going to come up stronger than it was before. Yes. So like this, Prabhupada explains that people in this world, they're like prisoners in a jail. And what is the prison? It's their lust. Their lust is keeping them imprisoned. If they become Krishna conscious, seriously, they'll become free from lust, and then they'll become free to act happily in Krishna consciousness. So Prabhupada says, I think at the end of the purport, let me just check. Srila Prabhupada says that what am I doing? Srila Prabhupada says, while one enjoys sense gratification, it may be that there's some feeling of happiness, but actually that so-called feeling of happiness is the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoyer. Yes, they engage in sense gratification hoping for happiness, and maybe they get some happiness, chapala sukha, flickering happiness, but that happiness is really the problem, is the enemy, because then they feel, yes, well, I should do it again because I got happiness. In this way, they become more attached. Okay, and then, so that was, oh no, okay. That was 39. So now 40. The senses, the mind, and the intelligence are the sitting places of this lust. Through them, lust covers the real knowledge of the living entity and bewilders him. So Prabhupada in the purport makes the point that the enemy lust has captured different very strategic positions in our bodies. The mind, the senses, and the intelligence. Those are the main parts of our existence, really. Yes. And in the purport, you'll see there, Prabhupada says, then the intelligence becomes the capital. Intelligence is the immediate neighbor of the soul. Lusty intelligence influences the soul to acquire false ego, identify with matter, and following that with the mind and senses. So in this way, the soul becomes addicted. Okay. And this is explained in Srimad Bhagavatam 1084, 13. 1084, 13. A human being who identifies this body made of three elements with his self, who considers the byproducts of the body to be his kinsmen, who considers the land of birth worshipable, and who goes to the place of pilgrimage simply to take bath, rather than meet men of transcendental knowledge there, is to be considered like an ass or a cow. 41. Therefore, Arjuna, best of the Bharatas, in the very beginning, curb this great symbol of sin, lust. How? By regulating the senses, and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. Regulate. First thing is to regulate the senses. So in regard to lust, this is done in household life. If through Krishna consciousness a person is able to not be overwhelmed and dominated by lust, but is able to maintain a celibate position happily, then, all right, then the lust is being controlled by Krishna consciousness. But if someone can't do that and they're really being pushed by lusty desires and it becomes a bit too much, then regulate your lusty desires in household life. And by that regulation, then stability will come. And just like our programs generally are regulated. Every morning we get up at the same time. Everything's the same. It's regulated. Generally, we may do the same service or, certain services the same. It's all part of regulating and then becoming internally stable. And then lust, if along with that one's nicely engaged in devotional service, then one will overcome the lust. So Srila Prabhupada in a class on some of these verses says, everyone in this material world is lusty to varying degrees. Everyone's trying to lord it over material nature. That is lust. The ant is trying to lord it over material nature in his way, and the so-called elevated politician is trying to lord it over material nature in a different way. Lording it over material nature is a sign of lust. On the other hand, Krishna consciousness means offering one's energy to Krishna. Energy is derived from Krishna and it should be offered to Krishna. For example, water is taken from the ocean. It goes to the clouds and again turns to water, falls down as rain, and flows in rivers to the ocean. Similarly, we derive our energy from Krishna. Now, again, if we let that energy glide down again towards Krishna, that is perfection. Verse 42, this is interesting. The hierarchy of the different aspects of our material nature in terms of the makeup our material makeup. 42. The working senses are superior to dull matter. Mind is higher than the senses. Intelligence is still higher than the mind. And he, the soul, is even higher than the intelligence. So this is the way the hierarchy is meant to be. That we know who we are. We're the eternal servants of Krishna. That's our real ego. Now we're situated spiritually. Then we guide or we direct our intelligence, make a plan for devotional service. The intelligence tells the mind, engage the senses. The intelligence makes a plan and then tells the mind, engage the senses in carrying out the plan, and the senses then engage the sense objects in carrying out the plan, and that's the correct hierarchy. But in material life, it's the other way around. The sense object tells the senses, don't I look nice? And the senses say, yes, you definitely do. And the senses tell the mind that look at this sense object, it's great. We must get it. And the mind tells the intelligence, you got to make a plan. Make some intelligent plan so we get the sense object. And the intelligence makes a plan. The plan is carried out. And then the sense object is dominating the person. You've become a servant of the sense object. Like take a cigarette. The cigarette tells the senses, don't I look nice? Wouldn't you like to smoke me? The senses tell the mind, hey, listen, look at this. Look at what we're perceiving. We're perceiving this beautiful cigarette. You should get it. And the mind tells the intelligence, hey, make a plan. We got to somehow get our hands on some cigarettes. And the intelligence figures it out. But the cigarette is controlling. The cigarette is in control. And the soul is just lost, situated in false ego, that I'm this body, and therefore to do like this is the right thing for me. And then, so we've got to be aware of that hierarchy and keep ourselves situated in terms of the hierarchy. So verse 43, last verse, thus knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind, and intelligence, O mighty armed Arjuna, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, Krishna consciousness, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. So the thing is, one has to be in Krishna consciousness, that I'm the eternal servant of Krishna. Therefore, I will control my mind through intelligence. So then the mind becomes controlled. The mind becomes steady, as Krishna says. Then the senses become steady. And then lust comes under control. So this is the program here. And Prabhupada says here, this is the sum total of this chapter. In the immature stage of material existence, philosophical speculations and artificial attempts to control the senses by the so-called practice of yogic postures can never help a man towards spiritual life. He must be trained in Krishna consciousness by higher intelligence. Yes. So there we are. So that was Prabhupada's concluding words we just read right now from this last purport. Let's just conclude by reading Shri Shri Radha Radhanath Shri Giri Govardhan Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu Ki Jai. Okay, please just sit down for 2 minutes. I'm going to read comments by Srila Prabhupada on this verse and a couple of other verses just here. An excerpt from a class of Prabhupada's. It's very nice. Please listen to this. To stop material desires, we must take shelter of the lotus feet of Krishna. The waves of a river are constantly flowing and cannot be stopped, but the waves of the river flow toward the sea. When the tide crosses the ocean, it overwhelms the flowing of the river, and the river itself becomes overflooded. You follow? The ocean overwhelms the river which is coming into it. The waves from the sea become more prominent than the waves of the river. Similarly, the devotee with intelligence plans so many things for the service of the Lord in Krishna consciousness, so many things that stagnant material desires become overflooded by the desire to serve Krishna. As confirmed by Yamunacharya, since he's been engaged in the service of the lotus feet of the Lord, there's always a current of newer and newer desires flowing to serve Krishna. So much so that the stagnant desire of sex life becomes very insignificant. Hare Krishna. So the idea is to take shelter of the Lord and just get deeply absorbed in devotional service with intelligent plans, engaging the intelligence, engaging all the different aspects of our being. And then those old material desires, they'll just become washed away. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.